how some patients, with like how they're contracted? Is
Uh-huh.
that like part of it? Like, because I've noticed some patients at a certain time, it's like their hands are stuck and we can't. So is that part of like,
It could be. So I don't know enough about pharmaceuticals to know, but I know that, right, there are certain pharmaceuticals that will affect the reuptake of acetylcholine, right? They'll affect neurotransmitters being taken back up by the neuron. And so if that neurotransmitter is not taken back up by the neuron, it's going to keep stimulating the muscle. And I don't know if that's part of the cause or if it's just an imbalance in, the ions in the body and the calcium, sodium, potassium, all that stuff. Because that can cause cramps too.
yeah, because I see some patients that come like completely contracted after a while. Like they'll be fine, but then after a certain time, it's like they're so contracted and stiff, it's like we can't even move them. And it's like, is that the process of what's going on?
Right.
It's like trying to some like bend their legs or move their hands where we have to put things in the middle of their hands, like little grippies, so their hands don't become permanently closed.
Right. I'm
So,
guessing what's happening is the some of that acetylcholine gets taken back up by the neuron, and I'm guessing that that's being blocked maybe by another medication or something that they're on, because there are definitely medications that block the reuptake of neurotransmitters, and so there's that constant stimulation, right, of the muscles, and eventually it just causes them to all lock up.
all right.
Yeah.
We're all here. Yay.
Yay. All right. So number of muscle fibers activated. Um, smooth contraction is accomplished by controlling number of muscle fibers stimulated within a skeletal muscle. Um, so again, when you contract a skeletal muscle, you're not contracting 100% of the fibers in that muscle, right? Usually you're only contracting a certain percentage of them. Most motor neurons control a number of fibers through a multiple branching axon terminal. So you have this one neuron and it branches and it goes to multiple muscle fibers within an entire whole muscle. And so you're getting stimulation most of the time to a certain number of those muscle fibers or a certain percentage of those muscle fibers. A motor unit is one single motor neuron and all the muscle fibers it controls. So you have this one motor neuron coming from your brain, and at the other end of it, it branches and it goes to usually multiple muscle fibers, and that is considered one motor unit. The size of this unit indicates the degree of control. So if you think about something where you have precise movements like the muscles of your eye, the motor units contain very few fibers per neuron, right? It's only your brain is only affecting a very few number of fibers. So you get that kind of fine tuning movement of your eye. Larger gross movements like the muscles in your leg, right? Think about just bending your knee, right? That's a huge, big chunk of muscle there. The motor unit could contain up to 2,000 muscle fibers per neuron. So you just have one neuron stimulating 2,000 fibers within that leg muscle, because you don't need fine tuning control like you do with your eye or with your fingers, right? You just need all of those muscle fibers to contract to move you. So here's a motor unit arrangement. Right here, they're talking about obviously your biceps. And this is your spinal cord, right? You have an axon coming from your spinal cord, and it will split when it gets to the end that's closest to the muscle, and it will activate multiple muscle fibers. So in this particular picture, they're showing 3 motor units, right? That's kind of your biceps have, a certain amount of fine tuning control to them. And so the purple is one motor unit, blue is another one, and the red is the third. And you can see that each of those goes to multiple muscle fibers. Each cylinder here is a muscle fiber. Muscle contraction requires large amounts of energy. Well, that's not a surprise, right? Large amounts of energy in the form of ATP. Resting muscle fiber contains only enough energy reserves to maintain contraction until more ATP is generated. During contraction, muscles generate ATP at the same rate as it is used. So these muscles, these cells, have mitochondria. And the mitochondria are what produce ATP. And they produce ATP from glucose and oxygen. Okay, that's what you need to make ATP. And when you start contracting these muscles, just walking around, just doing everyday things, normal everyday things, your muscles are able to generate more ATP at the same rate as being used. So we're talking about just normal walking around, writing things, talking, that sort of stuff. Once you start exercising, right, you get on a treadmill, for example, and you start running, your body, your muscles need more ATP, right? The demand is there for more energy. You're contracting the muscles more than you would normally contract them. So you need oxygen and you need glucose to make ATP. When you're on a treadmill, which do you think you run out of first? Do you think you run out of oxygen first or glucose first?
Glucose.
No, most of us have plenty of sugars reserved, right? Most of us eat more carbohydrates than we need, and we store all those extra carbohydrates. So most of us have a reserve of carbohydrates. But what happens, think about what happens to your breathing when you start running. Right? You start breathing, your breathing changes, you start breathing deeper, and then eventually you're kind of gasping, right? You're trying to get air in because you're trying to get that oxygen in. And what's going to happen is eventually you get to a point where you can't get enough oxygen in to keep up with the ATP demands. And so ATP just transfers energy from one area to another. So as you're breaking down carbohydrates, you transfer the energy from the carb to ATP. It doesn't store energy long term. You can't make a bunch of ATP and just store it for later. So at rest, the muscle fiber produces plenty of ATP. And the excess ATP is transferred to creatine, which forms creatine phosphate, which is why a lot of supplements have, creatine in them, because it should help you release some of that ATP. During contraction, each cross bridge breaks down ATP into ADP, and it uses that to shift in, right? Remember, myosin reaches up, it grabs onto actin, and then it shifts. It goes from being out this way to being in this way. To go from this position to this position, it takes energy, it takes ATP. And so it takes one molecule of ATP, let's say, to do that. When you break down ATP, right? ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So it's adenosine linked to 3 phosphates, triphosphate. What you're doing to get energy from ATP is you're breaking off that 3rd phosphate. And when you do, you end up with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, adenosine with 2 phosphates, and the 3rd phosphate is kind of out there, right? Because you've broken that 3rd one off. When you break that 3rd phosphate off, you release a bunch of energy, right? And so then you've got ADP and a 3rd phosphate floating around, and you've got another enzyme that comes and sticks that phosphate back on so that you can use that again. These energy reserves, whatever ATP you have in reserve, is used up in 15 seconds, right? So you have enough energy in reserve to, to run a 40-yard dash, maybe if you're a world-class sprinter, that kind of thing. But your energy gets used up really quickly. Then you have to generate ATP by a different means. So then it kicks in where you need aerobic metabolism, right? You need to get oxygen into your body so that you can start breaking down more and more carbohydrates. So that's why once you get on a treadmill after 15 seconds, your breathing is going to start to change because you're trying to get more oxygen into your body so that you can produce more ATP. At a certain point, you cannot get enough oxygen into your body to meet the demands for ATP. Right? At a certain point, your body says, okay, your muscles need this amount of ATP. You're only getting in this much oxygen. You can't fulfill that. At that point, you start what's called anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen, right? Aerobic is with oxygen, anaerobic is without oxygen. So at that point, you don't have any oxygen anymore. You can still go through anaerobic glycolysis. Well, guess what happens? At that point, the glucose, what you have in your body, the carbohydrates, what you have in your body, you can still start to break them down even without oxygen. With oxygen, you make about 34 ATP per glucose. Without oxygen, you make 2. Big difference, right? Big difference in how much ATP you make. You don't make a lot. The other big difference is that without oxygen, that glucose turns to lactic acid. Okay. And so lactic acid starts to build up in your muscles. So you're not getting enough oxygen in, right? Your muscles are starting to get sore. You're not making much ATP from the glucose that you have because you don't have enough oxygen. And lactic acid starts building up in your muscles. Well, guess what? When lactic acid builds up in your muscles, it triggers pain receptors. It does that on purpose, right? It does that because it's literally your body saying you cannot keep up this pace, right? It's literally your body saying you don't have enough oxygen to keep contracting this muscle. So now that lactic acid is starting to building up, that's going to trigger some pain receptors in your body. So if you've ever, gotten to that point where the muscles get so fatigued that you actually feel pain in them, that's what that is. It's lactic acid building up. Now, within seconds of stopping your exercise, whatever that exercise is or activity it is, your breathing will get in enough oxygen that lactic acid will be broken down really quickly. Okay, so within seconds, you're going to recover. But you need to recover. It's literally your body telling you to stop. So again, metabolism in resting muscle fibers. Again, here's your muscle, and here's the blood vessel right next to it. Muscle has a lot of mitochondria. The blood vessel is carrying things like oxygen and glucose, right, which get into your muscle. Your muscle uses glucose and oxygen to produce ATP, right? And creatine kind of helps that process. This is all good. This is what you want to do. At some point, you're not going to get enough oxygen, right? And when you don't get enough oxygen in, what happens is glucose gets converted to pyruvate. You only get the 2 ATP, right? And you end up with lactic acid building up, right? So that's during peak activity. I'm sorry, this is moderate activity. You can still produce ATP. At some point now you have no more oxygen coming from your blood vessels to your muscles, right? The glucose, which was stored as glycogen, turns to pyruvate, but without oxygen, it's going to turn to lactate. Lactic acid starts to build up in your muscles. So then we get to fast and slow twitch muscle fibers. You've probably heard of fast twitch and slow twitch muscle fibers. Fast, all of our muscles, right? All of our whole muscles are made up of some percentage of fast twitch and some percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers. It differs from person to person. It's largely dependent on genetics. You can train one versus the other, but you can't really increase the number of fast twitch muscle fibers or the number of slow twitch muscle fibers. You can train one or the other, right? To work stronger, to produce more tension. But you can't really produce more of those muscle fibers. Fast twitch muscle fibers reach peak tension very quickly. Most of the muscle fibers in your body are these. You have more fast twitch than slow twitch. They are larger in diameter. They have a lot of glycogen reserves, so a lot of glucose, relatively few mitochondria. So they rely more on glycolysis, densely packed myofibrils. So these are the ones that produce really powerful contractions over a short period of time. Right? Fast muscle twitch fibers, fast twitch muscle fibers. Think of a sprinter. When you look at a sprinter, like an Olympic sprinter, are they thin and wiry, or are they big and muscular?
Big muscular.
Big and muscular, right? Sprinters are pretty big. They have a lot of muscle. They have a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers. Because think about it, they only need to contract those muscles for 10 minutes, or for 10 seconds, right? 10 to 15 seconds, and they're done. So they don't need those muscle fibers that continually get oxygen to them for long periods of time. They have enough of an energy reserve to produce energy for those 10 or 15 seconds. So they have a lot of fast twitch, well-developed fast twitch muscle fibers. Now compare that to a marathon runner, right? We've probably all seen people that run marathons. What does a marathon runner look like? They look a lot like a sprinter?
No.
No. How are they built differently?
They are skinny.
Yeah, they're skinny, right? They have these long, lean muscles. They have a lot of the slow twitch muscle fibers because, as we'll see, a marathon runner needs to supply those muscles with oxygen for hours, right? They need to keep contracting those muscles for hours. The sprinter is going to run their race, their dash, and they're done in 10 or 15 seconds. They can breathe again, they can rest again. A marathon runner can't do that. They've got to run, the best marathon runners run it in 2 hours, right? The average is probably somewhere around 3.5 to 4 hours. That's a long period of time to contract muscles. So slow skeletal muscle fibers, or slow twitch muscle fibers, are smaller in diameter than fast twitch fibers. They are slower than fast twitch fibers. They're not going to give you that quick contraction, but they're specialized to allow for aerobic respiration. So as long as you're getting in oxygen, they can break down carbohydrates and use oxygen to keep making energy to contract for really long periods of time. So these would be the fibers that are really well developed in a marathon runner, in a long distance cycler, that kind of thing. Right. The percentages vary, right? Fast twitch fibers are often called white muscle because white muscle is dominated by fast fibers. It appears pale. Slow twitch fibers are considered red muscles because the slow fibers have more of a blood supply going to them. They need that continuous supply of oxygen. So the way to get the oxygen and the glucose there is by the bloodstream. So slow twitch muscle fibers have a lot more blood going to them. So they have a redder appearance because they have all this blood going to them. Most human muscle is a mixture of the two, right? Which is why it's pink. So muscle conditioning and performance. Physical conditioning and training can increase power and endurance. So you can do both things. You can do one or the other. You can concentrate on one or the other. Anaerobic endurance is the length of time muscle contractions can be supported by glycolysis and existing ATP reserves. These are brief, intense workouts. This is like you go to the gym and you're lifting weights, right? And you do your set of squats and you rest a minute. You can do another set and you rest a minute. You want those muscles in your legs, in those cases, to contract with the most contraction, with the most tension they can produce for 10 seconds, for 15 seconds, right? You're not contracting those muscles for 2 hours. Aerobic endurance is completely the opposite of that. It's where you get on a treadmill and you run for 2 or 3 hours, right? Or the exercise bike or the elliptical machine or whatever, whatever it is, or you get outside and you run. And you're training yourself with aerobic endurance. You're training those slow twitch muscle fibers to continually get oxygen and to make ATP from that oxygen and be able to sustain contractions for a long period of time. Now, to get in probably the best healthy shape is, you would do both of these things, right? You would do aerobic endurance some days and you would do anaerobic endurance some days. You do weightlifting some days and you would do running some days. And it's going to train, one's going to train fast twitch muscle fibers, one's going to train slow twitch muscle fibers. That's probably going to get you in the best shape.
Mm.
All right. Everything we've talked about so far is skeletal muscle. So there are other types of muscle. There is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is found only in the heart. It is involuntary. You cannot contract your heart. You can make it contract slower or faster, but you can't contract it. Cardiac muscle cells are pretty small compared to skeletal muscle cells. They usually have one nucleus. They're branched, the way they look a little bit different. And they have these gap junctions, these specialized gap junctions called intercalated discs. These allow for one cardiac muscle cell to communicate with the cardiac muscle cell right next to it. And that becomes really important because you want all of the muscle cells of your heart to contract at the same time, right? That's going to give your heart the most strength when it contracts. And so in order for those cells to communicate with each other, they have these specialized communication sites called intercalated discs where they can get those signals to each other. And so here you can see a cardiac muscle cell. You can see where some of these intercalated discs are. They look like just a darker stripe, right? You can see the light stripes here, but this looks like a darker stripe. And then smooth muscle is also small like cardiac muscle. They are spindle shaped and have a single nucleus. They're found in the walls of many organs. So think of your digestive system has a lot of smooth muscle. Your blood vessels have a lot of smooth muscle, your lungs, right? And these don't contract very quickly. Like skeletal muscle we saw contracts within a few milliseconds, right? Smooth muscle contracts much slower, but it's constantly contracting, right? This is how we get food through our digestive system. It's just constantly contracting. And so even though it's not very quick or very strong, it's involuntary. It's just this repetitive contraction all the time. Here's a picture of smooth muscle cells, right? And here's a comparison of skeletal muscle fibers versus cardiac versus smooth. You can see how much bigger skeletal muscles are. They have multiple nuclei. Smooth is the only muscle that's not arranged in sarcomeres. They don't have any stripes, right? And you can see how calcium is what causes skeletal muscle fibers to contract, causes all muscle fibers to contract. The contraction happens fastest with skeletal muscle fibers and slower with cardiac and smooth muscle, right? So it just gives you a nice comparison of the three types of muscle. Then we get to naming the muscles, right? And origin, insertion, primary action, that kind of thing. So I'm going to go to origin insertion first. If we think about a muscle, especially on your limb, think about something like your biceps, right? Your biceps have two ends. One end is up by your shoulder, one end is down by your elbow. One end is called the origin, the other is called the insertion. When you contract that muscle, the origin stays stationary, the insertion moves. Okay. So in the case of your biceps, is the end that's by your shoulder, is that the origin or the insertion?
Origin.
That's the origin, right? Your shoulder pretty much stays put where it is when you contract your biceps. The end that moves is the end by the elbow. So that's where the insertion is, right? So all muscles do, remember, is get shorter. Well, if you attach that muscle to a bone, one end stationary, when it gets shorter, it pulls that bone with it. And the action is what happens when the muscle contracts. So for example, when you contract your biceps, that's called flexion, right? Extension is going back to 180 degrees, and that's contracting your triceps on the back of your arm is extension, flexion, extension. Adduction and abduction are two common words for actions, and we won't get much into those in this class. But I do want to mention that muscles have primary actions. You always have a prime mover. So the prime mover is the muscle that's chiefly responsible for the movement. So muscles tend to work together, right? You don't have, when you do something in reality, right? When you lift up a box or something like that, you're not just using one muscle. You're using many muscles in your body. But the muscle that you're using the most for that is the prime mover. The other muscles that are helping you to lift that box are called synergists. They work along with that muscle group. So they're muscles that help the prime mover work efficiently. So for example, if you're using your back to lift something up, a synergist of your back muscles is your bicep, right? You're using your biceps and your back together. But your biceps are not the prime mover, not the primary thing responsible for that movement. The antagonist works against the prime mover. So if you're using your back muscles, the antagonist will be your chest muscles, your pectoralis, right? They're opposite your back muscles. They do the opposite thing. If you're talking about your bicep, the antagonist is your tricep. It's on the back of your arm. It does the opposite thing, right? Your bicep moves your elbow or moves your arm this way, bends your elbow that way. Your tricep straightens it back out. So antagonists are always doing the opposite of the prime mover. And so here is an example, right? Moving the elbow, flexing the elbow. The biceps brachii is the prime mover. That's the one that mostly causes your elbow to bend. The triceps is the antagonist. It's going to straighten it back out. Then you have a couple of smaller muscles called the brachialis and the brachioradialis. They are synergists in the flexion of the elbow. So they help the biceps brachii. The rhomboid muscles in your back are also synergists to the biceps. And we won't get into the basics of naming these muscles, but what I do want to do is go through the names of the muscles. And so I posted a Word document of the muscles to know. So these are the only muscles that I will hold you responsible for, ones that are on this Word document, very few on there. And I've tried to organize them into the different areas of the body. So sometimes the name of the muscle tells you the shape. Sometimes it tells you something about where the muscle is. Sometimes it tells you something about what the muscle does. For example, the first one there, orbicularis oculi. Well, orbicularis comes from the same word as orbit. So that means around, right? Oculi tells you it goes around your eye, right? Like ocular. So those are the round muscles that go around your eye. The second one there, orbicularis oris. Again, orbicularis is round. There's a round muscle. Orbicularis oris goes around your mouth, right? Oris, like you do an oral presentation for class, that's where the oris comes from. So a lot of times you can figure out where these muscles are based on their names. Obviously, the occipitalis and the frontalis are over the occipital or the frontal bone. The masseter is on the side of your cheek. It's what allows you to open and close your jaw. And your platysma is in your neck. Okay. On your upper torso, so this would be, we'll start on the back. Your trapezius is kind of a triangle shaped muscle. It's on your upper back. It allows you to shrug your shoulders straight up. Your latissimus dorsi, again, the name tells you something. Latissimus tells you that it goes all the way to the lateral edge of your body. Dorsi means it's on the dorsal side of your body, right? These are your commonly called your lats, right? They're these big, these wide muscles that are on your back. Your deltoid, where's your deltoid? Who knows where your deltoid is?
Shoulder.
Your shoulder cap, right? And it gets the name from the Greek letter delta. Do any of you guys know what how you would write the Greek letter delta?
A triangle, and it usually means a change in something.
Right, it's a triangle, and it's usually to abbreviate a change in something. Well, if you flip that triangle upside down, your shoulder is triangle shaped, right? Here's the base, and then it points down. And that muscle is a triangular shaped muscle, and that's why it's got the name deltoid. Pectoralis major, I think most people know where that is. Where's that?
Yes.
Your chest, good. Your rectus abdominis. Rectus means a long straight muscle. So it's a long straight muscle in the abdominal region, right? That's if somebody has a six pack, that's their rectus abdominis. Pectoralis minor is underneath the pectoralis major. Which one do you think is bigger, the minor or the major?
Major.
Major, right? That's why they're named that way. The major is bigger than the minor. And then the sternocleidomastoid is a big mouthful to say, but you can break that word down into three parts and it tells you what bones it's attached to. So sterno, what bone is that, do you think?
The chest one.
Yeah, your sternum, right?
Yeah.
Clado. Does anybody know what clado would be? What bone it would be? It's your clavicle, right? So this is attached to your sternum and your clavicle, and then your mastoid. Mastoid is the little bump right behind your ear, right? So this runs, this is in your neck. It's from your sternum and your clavicle up behind your ear. We have the upper limb, the triceps brachii. Brachii tells you where it is, right? It's in the upper limb. Triceps tells you it's got three heads to it. Looks like three separate muscles. And the biceps brachii, we know where that is on the other side of that. The muscles that make up the rotator cuff. So if you watch sports, a lot of times you hear about people with rotator cuff injuries. The rotator cuff is actually made up of four muscles. It's called the SITS group, S-I-T-S. The first S is supraspinatus. The second, the I is infraspinatus. The T is teres minor. And the second S is subscapularis. Those four muscles are attached to the scapula, which is your shoulder blade. And those make up your rotator cuff, right? Underneath the biceps is the brachialis. If you remove the biceps, it's right underneath it. And then there's a brachioradialis, which starts where your biceps are, and it ends up on the thumb side of your forearm. That's where your radial bone is. Okay, we have the rectus abdominis again, which I mentioned up here. Your external oblique. Obliques allow you to twist side to side. So your abdominis muscle just allows you to bend forward. Your oblique muscles allow you to turn. So those go around the side of your trunk. The most superficial is called the external oblique. If you cut that away, deep to that, underneath that is the internal oblique. So they're running in the same place, just one is on top of the other. Okay, and then in the lower limb, kind of the outside of the hip, you have what's called the tensor fascia latae, right? On the front of the thigh, the big muscle right in the front is called the rectus femoris. Again, rectus is a big straight muscle, femoris because it's over the femur. On either side of that, you have the vastus lateralis and the vastus medialis. That makes sense. The lateralis is on the outside, the medialis is on the inside. You have the sartorius going across the front of your leg. So that goes from your hip to the inside of your knee. You have the gluteus maximus, which is your butt. Right? You have your biceps femoris, which is one of the muscles of your hamstring group. So that's on the back of your thigh. So make sure when you say biceps, you say whether you're talking about the biceps brachii or the biceps femoris. And then your lower leg, you have the gastrocnemius, which is your calf muscle. So that's the kind of the grapefruit sized muscle in your calf. And you have on the front of your leg, the tibialis anterior. Well, that tells you exactly where it is, right? It's on the anterior side of your tibia. You also have a soleus. The soleus is directly underneath or directly deep to the gastrocnemius, I should say. Right, so if you cut and remove the gastrocnemius, you have your soleus underneath that. And then you have your calcaneal tendon, which is the same as your Achilles tendon. right? That attaches your calf to the bottom of your foot. So it just attaches your calf muscle. It kind of wraps it around underneath your heel and holds it in place there. So those are the only muscles you need to know. You can find those muscles on these diagrams. You can find them probably in a lot of places, but make sure that you have that sheet when you're looking at the muscles, because anywhere that you look at the muscles, there will be more than what are on that sheet, right? So make sure you're only studying those that are found on this sheet. Questions? So I will make the test available today. You'll have a week to do it, like always. And then we will meet again on Friday and start going over the nervous system. Even though not everybody will have done the test, we'll at least get started on it. And we'll talk more about what we're going to do for the labs. There's a sheep brain in that box, and so we'll do a sheep brain dissection.
Oh, boy.
Excited.
Pretty cool, actually. I like it.
I know, I'm nervous on having the peel thing. I don't want to destroy it.
That's
I
okay.
watched your video on it, so I know you were saying go very slow and easy and
Right, in certain parts. Yeah, there's certain parts of the sheep brain that you don't want to, just rip things off of. But once you get to a certain point, you can just start cutting, randomly, and that's usually what people do who are interested in it, right? They actually start chopping this up all different ways to see what's there and everything, which is cool.
and so we'll go through everything with you for the lab and take pictures as we're going.
Absolutely.
Oh, boy.
And that you said it's next week?
Right. So we won't do it on Friday. We'll probably do it next Wednesday. Right. Part of the class will devote to doing the dissection.
All right.
That'll be fun. And everything's in the kit we need, right?
Yes,
So-
there's instruments there. There's a scalpel and all that stuff in there. There's a tray to do it on, that kind of stuff.
All right. I didn't know if I should bring gloves home from work.
There are gloves in the kit. Yep, there are latex gloves in there. But I
Is that a
mean, you can
urine
bring some
test in
home if you
there?
want. What's that?
Is that
I
a
think there-
urine test in there?
There is a urine test in there, and we didn't use it last semester. I'm not sure if we're going to this semester. I've always done, when we get to that point where we talk about kidney function, I've always done using simulated urine, right? We've got these different simulated pee samples, and people have to try to figure out what the patient may have wrong with them, right? Based on sugar that's in them, based on the pH, all that kind of stuff. So I've never actually done it with a real pee sample. So I don't know that we're going to do that, but we'll see. The same thing with the blood typing is actually blood typing your own blood type. So there's a little, like a diabetic testing needle that you just prick your finger with and get a couple drops of blood out of it. And you can do your own blood typing.
So it tells you what type of blood type you are and everything. I mean, I
Yep.
already know what type I am, but still.
So I mean, that's good in a lot of ways to make sure that the thing is actually accurate to what you know, right? What I found last semester, it seemed like the few people that actually knew their blood type, it seemed like the kit came up with the same thing that they already thought they were, which is a good.
The only reason I know is I got a card from the Red Cross when I donated blood.
Yep, me too. Yeah, if you donate, they tell you exactly what you are.
Yeah. I'm excited on that one. I'm actually excited on the whole kit.
Good.
I just have to keep somebody's nose out of it.
Exactly.
She's tall enough to reach the counter, so that's what I'm a little worried about. So
Uh-oh.
yeah, I don't want her to think it's a snack.
Right.
Alrighty.
All
Right.
right.
Have a good day.
You
Yeah,
too.
you guys-
All right, guys. I
All
gotta
right.
get, I'm gonna take
Yeah,
a nap
Friday.
before I gotta pick up the hubby.